The dust swirled around Clara's worn boots as she stood beside her father's wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scorching prairie sun beat down mercilessly on the small trading post, where a handful of weathered buildings huddled together against the endless expanse of grasslands stretching to the horizon. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means the world. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story. "This is for your own good, Clara," her father muttered, avoiding her gaze as he fumbled with the leather pouch at his belt. "A girl your age needs discipline, structure. And Lord knows I can't provide it." Clara's green eyes blazed with fury and disbelief. At 17, she was no longer the obedient child who had once helped her mother tend their small garden back in Missouri. That life seemed like a distant dream now. 3 years after consumption had claimed her mother and left her alone with a father who saw her as nothing more than a burden. "You can't be serious, Papa," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're actually going to sell me? Your own daughter?" Before he could answer, the saloon doors creaked open, and out stepped the most peculiar figure Clara had ever laid eyes on. The man was enormous, not just tall, but broad as a barn door, with a belly that strained against his buckskin shirt and arms like tree trunks. His beard was a wild tangle of black and gray, and his hair hung in greasy strands beneath a battered hat that had seen better decades. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue and surprisingly gentle, though they were nearly lost in the folds of his weathered face. This had to be Hank Bigfoot Hunter, the legendary tracker and mountain man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Stories about him ranged from the miraculous to the impossible. They said he could track a whisper across solid rock, that he'd wrestled bears with his bare hands, that he once brought down a buffalo with nothing but a slingshot and sheer stubbornness. "Afternoon, Thompson," Hank rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, each step deliberate and careful. "This the girl?" Clara's father nodded quickly, eager to complete the transaction. "Yes, sir. Clara. She's a good girl, just needs a firm hand." Hank's pale eyes studied Clara for a long moment, and she found herself standing straighter under his gaze. She expected to see cruelty there, perhaps lust, but instead found only a curious assessment, as if he were evaluating a horse he might purchase. "How much?" Hank asked simply. $50, her father replied quickly. "And that's a bargain, considering—" "I'll give you 20, Hank interrupted, pulling out a small leather pouch. "Not because she ain't worth more, but because any man who'd sell his own daughter ain't worth full price." Clara felt a small spark of surprise. Was this giant actually defending her? Her father's face reddened, but he was in no position to bargain. $20 was more than he'd seen in months. "Fine," he muttered, snatching the coins from Hank's massive palm. "Papa." Clara's voice was small now, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. "You're really doing this?" Her father couldn't meet her eyes. "It's for the best, Clara. You'll see." He climbed onto his wagon without another word and snapped the reins, leaving her standing in the dust with her single carpetbag and the enormous stranger who now owned her. Clara watched until the wagon disappeared into the shimmering heat haze, then turned to face her new reality. Hank Hunter stood quietly beside her, chewing on what appeared to be a piece of jerky. "Well," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "I suppose you're going to tell me what horrible fate awaits me now." Hank's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. "Horrible? Girl, I ain't in the business of horrible. I'm in the business of survival." He shouldered her bag as if it weighed nothing. "Come on. We got work to do." Clara had expected to be dragged to some filthy cabin and subjected to unspeakable horrors. Instead, she found herself following Hank to a surprisingly well-maintained camp about a mile outside of town. 2 large canvas tents stood beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees, with a stone fire ring and several wooden crates arranged in an orderly fashion. "This is your tent," Hank said, indicating the smaller of the two. "You'll find blankets and such inside. We rise with the sun, eat what we catch or gather, and we work every day. No exceptions." Clara peeked inside the tent and was surprised to find it clean and comfortable, with a proper bedroll and even a small mirror hanging from the center pole. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously. "Hunting. Tracking. Surviving." Hank was already moving around the camp with practiced efficiency, checking various supplies and equipment. "Your daddy might have sold you to me, but I ain't bought myself a slave. I bought myself an apprentice." "An apprentice?" Clara couldn't hide her confusion. "But I don't know anything about hunting or tracking or surviving." "No," Hank agreed, "but you're gonna learn. Sit." It wasn't a request. Clara found herself perched on a wooden crate, watching as this mountain of a man prepared what turned out to be surprisingly good rabbit stew over the fire. "Tell me about yourself, girl," he said as he stirred the pot. "And don't give me any of that poor little me nonsense. I want to know what you can do." Clara thought about it. What could she do? "I can read and write. I know some arithmetic. I can sew and cook, though not over an open fire. I can tend a garden." She paused. "I can shoot a little. Papa taught me when I was younger, before he decided selling you was easier than raising you," Hank finished bluntly. "Can you ride?" "Some." "Can you walk 20 miles without whining?" Clara bristled. "I don't know. I've never tried." "We'll find out tomorrow." He ladled stew into a tin bowl and handed it to her. "Eat up. You're gonna need your strength." The stew was surprisingly good, rich with herbs that Clara couldn't identify. As she ate, she studied her captor. No, she corrected herself, her employer? Master? The relationship was unclear, but Hank didn't seem interested in clarifying it. "Why did you buy me?" she asked finally. Hank was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he said, "You ever seen a hawk try to hunt with a broken wing, girl?" "No, sir." "Pitiful sight. All that natural skill and instinct, but it can't do what it was born to do. So it starves, or gets eaten by something bigger and meaner." He looked at her directly. "Your daddy broke your wing when he sold you. But wings can heal if they're set proper." Clara felt something stir in her chest, not quite hope, but perhaps the memory of what hope felt like. "And you think you can set my wing?" "I think you can set it yourself, once you remember what wings are for." Hank stood and began cleaning his bowl. "Now get some rest. We start your education at dawn." Clara was awakened by what sounded like a bear attempting to sing opera. It took her several confused moments to realize it was Hank, humming tunelessly as he rekindled the fire in the pre-dawn darkness. "Rise and shine, apprentice," he called cheerfully. "Day's wasting." "It's still dark," Clara protested, but she was already climbing out of her bedroll. Something about Hank's manner made disobedience seem pointless. "Best light for tracking," he replied, handing her a cup of coffee so strong it could probably strip paint. "Finish that and we'll get moving." 20 minutes later, Clara found herself trudging through the tall grass beside this hulking figure, trying to keep up with his deceptively long stride. The prairie was coming alive around them, birds calling, insects buzzing, and somewhere in the distance, the lonely howl of a coyote. "First lesson," Hank said without preamble. "Everything talks out here. You just gotta learn the language." "What do you mean?" Hank stopped abruptly and pointed to the ground. "What do you see?" Clara looked down and saw nothing but grass and dirt. Nothing." "Look closer." She knelt and examined the ground more carefully. After a moment, she noticed a slight depression in the earth, roughly oval-shaped. "Is that a footprint?" "Deer," Hank confirmed. "Young doe, probably 6 months old. Came through here about 2 hours ago, heading toward water." He pointed to a barely visible trail through the grass. "See how the grass is bent?" She was moving slow, not spooked. Probably stopped to graze right about. He walked a few steps and pointed to another spot. "Here." Clara stared in amazement. To her, it was just grass, but Hank was reading it like words on a page. "How can you possibly know all that?" "Same way you know the difference between an and b," Hank replied. "Practice. Now you try. Find me another track." For the next hour, Clara crawled around on her hands and knees, searching for signs that Hank could apparently see from 50 yards away. She was hot, frustrated, and covered in dirt when she finally spotted something. "There!" she exclaimed, pointing to a clear paw print in a patch of soft earth. Hank ambled over to examine her find. "Good. What do you think it is?" Clara studied the print carefully. It was about the size of her palm, with 4 distinct toes and what looked like claw marks. "A dog." "Close. Coyote. See how the print's more oval than round? And the claw marks are sharper than a dog's would be." He straightened up, and Clara was surprised to see something that might have been pride in his expression. Not bad for a first try. They spent the rest of the morning following various trails, with Hank patiently explaining what each sign meant. Clara's head was spinning with information about gait patterns, scat identification, and the subtle differences between various animal tracks. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked as they finally headed back to camp. "Because knowing how to read the land might save your life someday," Hank replied matter-of-factly. "Out here, ignorance kills quicker than rattlesnakes." That afternoon, Hank began teaching her how to properly maintain and use firearms. Clara had shot her father's old rifle a few times, but Hank's approach was entirely different. He treated weapons with a combination of respect and familiarity that spoke of long experience. "A gun ain't a magic wand," he explained as he showed her how to properly clean and oil his massive Sharps rifle. "It's a tool like a hammer or a saw. Useful, but only if you know how to use it right." Clara found herself oddly fascinated by the intricate mechanics of the weapon. Hank was a patient teacher, never showing frustration when she struggled with the loading procedure or couldn't hit the tin cans he set up as targets. "You're thinking too hard," he said after her 10th consecutive miss. "Shooting's about feeling, not thinking. The gun's part of you, the target's part of the landscape, and you're just connecting them." "That doesn't make any sense," Clara protested. "Don't it?" Hank took the rifle and, without seeming to aim, put a bullet through the center of a can 40 yards away. "Try again. This time, don't think about the gun or the target or your breathing or your stance. Just look at what you want to hit and trust your body to figure out the rest." Clara took a deep breath and tried to follow his advice. Instead of analyzing every aspect of the shot, she simply looked at the can and squeezed the trigger. The can jumped and spun away. "I hit it," she exclaimed, surprised by her own excitement. "Course you did," Hank said calmly, but Clara caught the hint of a smile in his voice. "You just had to stop getting in your own way." Over the next few weeks, Clara's life settled into a routine unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Each day brought new challenges and lessons, from identifying edible plants to building snares and reading weather patterns in the behavior of birds. Hank proved to be a surprisingly thoughtful teacher, though his methods were unconventional. When Clara struggled to remember the differences between various animal tracks, he had her draw them in the dirt while reciting silly rhymes he made up on the spot. Deer prints look like teardrops falling, coyote paws are longer, sprawling, bear tracks big as dinner plates. Rabbit hops leave figure eights. His deep, rumbling voice made the ridiculous verses even more absurd, but Clara found herself remembering the information perfectly. One evening, as they sat around the fire sharing a meal of fish, Clara had caught herself, with considerable coaching from Hank, she found herself actually laughing at one of his stories about a particularly stubborn mule he'd once owned. "So there I was, standing in 3 feet of mud, arguing with a mule who was convinced that Creek was actually a fire-breathing dragon," Hank was saying, gesturing expansively with his coffee cup. "And this mule, see, he was smarter than most people I know, but he had this one peculiar fear." Clara found herself genuinely entertained by the tale, which involved the mule, a traveling preacher, and an unfortunate incident with a hornet's nest. When was the last time she'd laughed like this? She couldn't remember. "You're different than I expected," she said when Hank finished his story. "Different how?" Clara hesitated, then decided on honesty. "When Papa sold me to you, I thought you'd be cruel. That you'd want to hurt me or use me for." She trailed off, blushing. Hank was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I reckon a lot of men would," he said finally. "But I ain't most men. And you ain't most girls." "What do you mean?" "Most girls your age, they've been trained to be helpless. Taught to smile pretty and keep their mouths shut and depend on men to take care of them. But you got fire in you, Clara. Intelligence. Strength you don't even know you have yet. He looked at her directly. Be ashamed to waste all that on being some man's decoration. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Is that why you're teaching me all this? So I won't be helpless? I'm teaching you because everyone deserves to know they can survive on their own, Hank replied. Ain't no man should own another person, no matter what some piece of paper says. The implications of his words hit Clara like a physical blow. You mean, I'm not really your property? Hank snorted. Girl, you belong to yourself. You always have. I just paid your daddy $20 to get you away from him before he did something worse than sell you to me. Clara stared at him in amazement. So I could leave? If I wanted to? Course you could. But where would you go? Back to your daddy? He made it clear he don't want you. Into town, to work in the saloon, or marry the first man who'll have you. Hank shook his head. You got better options than that, if you're willing to work for them. What kind of options? Well, there's always demand for good trackers and hunters. Especially ones smart enough to read and write and do arithmetic. Hank poked at the fire with a stick. And there's other things too. I heard tell there's women out in California running their own businesses, owning their own land. But that takes money, and skills, and confidence. And you think you can teach me those things? I think you can learn them, if you want to. Hank's pale eyes met hers across the fire. Question is, do you want to? Clara thought about her options, really thought about them, perhaps for the first time in her life. She could run away, try to make it on her own with no money and few skills. She could try to find another man to marry, trading one form of dependence for another. Or she could stay here, in this strange new world where she was learning to read the land like a book and hit targets from impossible distances. I want to learn, she said finally. Good, Hank replied, as if the matter was settled. Tomorrow we start working on hunting with a bow. Quieter than a rifle, and arrows are easier to make than bullets. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded of how stories connect us, across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, know that you are a part of this shared story, with all your heart and soul. 6 weeks into her apprenticeship, Clara had grown confident in her new skills. She could track a rabbit through rocky terrain, identify a dozen different edible plants, and had even brought down a small deer with Hank's guidance. She was beginning to think she understood what this strange, gentle giant was trying to teach her. She was wrong. Time for your first real test, Hank announced one morning as they broke camp. We're heading into the Badlands. Clara had heard stories about the Badlands, a harsh, unforgiving stretch of broken terrain where water was scarce and danger lurked around every wind-carved boulder. Why? She asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of her voice. Because comfortable ain't real, Hank replied simply. You can practice all you want in easy country, but until you've been tested by something that might actually kill you, you don't know what you can do. They rode hard for most of the day, leaving the familiar grasslands behind for increasingly barren and rocky terrain. By evening, they were camping in a narrow canyon where the wind howled like lost souls and the temperature dropped dramatically as soon as the sun disappeared. Tomorrow you hunt alone, Hank announced as they huddled around their small fire. Alone? Clara tried to keep the panic out of her voice. But what if I get lost? What if I run into trouble? Then you'll figure it out, Hank said calmly. Or you won't. That's what makes it a test. Clara spent a sleepless night wrestling with fear and self-doubt. When dawn came, gray and cold, Hank handed her a rifle, a water bottle, and a small pack. You got until sunset to bring back something edible, he said. Don't come back empty-handed. And if I don't come back at all? Hank's weathered face cracked into one of his rare smiles. Then I reckon I wasted $20. Clara wanted to punch him. Instead, she shouldered the rifle and set off into the maze of canyons and rocky outcroppings that stretched endlessly in every direction. The first few hours were pure terror. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow might hide some unseen danger. Clara found herself jumping at the call of ravens and the skitter of lizards across stone. But gradually, her training began to assert itself. She started noticing things. The track of a jackrabbit in sandy soil, the scar on a tree where deer had rubbed their antlers, the way certain plants grew only near underground water. By midday, she had found and followed a game trail that led to a small spring hidden in a cluster of boulders. And there, drinking peacefully in the shade, was a young pronghorn antelope. Clara's heart hammered as she carefully raised the rifle. The animal was less than 50 yards away, an easy shot by Hank's standards, but Clara had never hunted alone before. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to feel the weight of the rifle, to trust in the skills Hank had taught her. The shot rang out like thunder in the confined space of the canyon. The pronghorn leaped once and collapsed. Clara stood frozen for a moment, hardly believing she'd actually done it. Then elation flooded through her, not just at making the shot, but at everything that had led up to it. She had tracked the animal, found its water source, positioned herself properly, and made a clean kill. She had done it all herself. The work of field dressing the animal and preparing it for transport was messy and difficult, but Clara had watched Hank do it dozens of times. By late afternoon, she was trudging back toward their camp with her prize, tired but triumphant. She found Hank sitting by the fire, apparently unconcerned about her absence. "Took you long enough," he said mildly, but Clara caught the relief in his voice. "I got lost twice," she admitted, dropping the wrapped meat beside the fire. "And it took me forever to find anything worth shooting. But you found your way back, and you didn't come empty-handed." Hank examined her work with a critical eye. "Clean kill, good field dressing. Not bad for a first try." Clara felt a warm glow of pride at his approval. "Does this mean I pass your test?" "This was just the first test," Hank replied, but his tone was gentle. "But yeah, you passed. Question now is, what do you want to do with what you learned?" Clara thought about it as they prepared their meal. 6 weeks ago, she had been a frightened girl with no prospects beyond whatever man might be willing to take her father's cast-off daughter. Now she was sitting in the wilderness, having provided their dinner with her own skill and effort. "I want to learn more," she said finally. "Everything you can teach me." "Good," Hank replied. "Because we ain't even started yet." 3 months into her apprenticeship, Clara had begun to think of herself as competent. She could track, hunt, and survive in conditions that would have killed the girl her father had sold. She was stronger, more confident, and had begun to understand what Hank meant about finding her wings. Then they rode into Willow Creek, and Clara discovered how much she still had to learn. Willow Creek was larger than the trading post where her father had sold her, with a proper main street lined with businesses and a hotel that actually had glass windows. It was also, Clara quickly realized, a town with strong opinions about proper behavior. "You can't bring that person into my establishment," the hotel clerk said when Hank approached the front desk. He was a thin, nervous man with a mustache that looked like a dead caterpillar, and he was staring at Clara with unconcealed disgust. Clara looked down at herself and saw what he saw, a girl in men's clothing, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands, standing beside a mountain of a man who looked like he'd been carved from the landscape itself. "This is my apprentice," Hank said mildly, but Clara heard steel in his voice. "She needs a room and a hot meal." "I don't care what she is to you," the clerk replied, his voice rising. "Decent women don't dress like men and travel with—" "With what?" Hank's voice had gone very quiet. The clerk seemed to realize he was treading on dangerous ground. "Perhaps there's another establishment more suited to your needs," he said weakly. Clara felt her face burning with shame and anger. She had been so proud of her new skills, so confident in what she was becoming, that she had forgotten how the world saw women like her. "Come on," Hank said quietly. "We'll find somewhere else." But as they turned to leave, Clara felt something rebellious rise in her chest. "No," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. Both men turned to stare at her. "I said no." Clara walked back to the desk and placed both hands flat on its surface, leaning forward until she was eye to eye with the nervous clerk. "I have money to pay for a room. I'm not asking for charity, and I'm not asking for your approval. I'm a paying customer, and you're going to treat me like one." "I most certainly am not," the clerk sputtered. "The very idea. A woman dressed like a man traveling with, it's indecent." "What's indecent?" Clara replied evenly, is judging people by their appearance instead of their character. Now, do I get a room, or do I have to find the sheriff and explain why the only hotel in town is refusing service to travelers with money? The clerk's face had gone pale. Clara could see him calculating the potential consequences of both choices. Finally, his fear of losing business won out over his moral outrage. "One night," he said grudgingly, "and you'll keep to your room. I won't have you corrupting the other guests with your unconventional behavior." "Fair enough," Clara replied, though inside she was shaking with adrenaline. "We'll take 2 rooms." As they climbed the stairs to their rooms, Hank was unusually quiet. Finally, Clara couldn't stand it anymore. "Are you angry with me?" she asked. "Angry?" Hank stopped outside her door and looked down at her with something that might have been pride. "Girl, that was the finest piece of negotiating I've seen in years. You didn't back down, you didn't lose your temper, and you got what you wanted without anyone getting shot." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "Course you were. That's what made it brave." Hank paused, seeming to consider his words. "You're changing, Clara. Becoming who you were meant to be. But that ain't always gonna be easy. Some folks don't like women who can take care of themselves." "What am I supposed to do about that?" "Same thing you did downstairs. Stand your ground, be reasonable, but don't apologize for being who you are." Hank's pale eyes met hers. "Your daddy tried to make you ashamed of being strong. Don't let anyone else do it either." That night, Clara lay in her first real bed in months and thought about Hank's words. She had changed, not just in skills and knowledge, but in something deeper. The frightened girl who had been sold like livestock was gone, replaced by someone Clara was still getting to know. She thought about the clerk's reaction, about the stares they'd gotten on the street, about the whispered comments she'd overheard. Part of her wanted to go back to being invisible, to avoid the judgment and disapproval. But a larger part of her, the part that had grown strong under Hank's patient teaching, refused to apologize for what she was becoming. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Clara was coming down for breakfast when she saw a woman about her own age sitting in the hotel lobby, clearly waiting for someone. The woman was everything Clara no longer was: pale, delicately dressed, with her blonde hair arranged in perfect ringlets. She looked like a china doll, beautiful and fragile. "Miss Thompson," the woman said, rising gracefully as Clara approached. Clara stopped short. No one had called her by her family name in months. "Yes. I'm Elizabeth Hartwell. My father owns the bank here in town." The woman's voice was soft and cultured, with just a hint of disapproval. "I heard about your unusual situation, and I wanted to speak with you." "What kind of situation would that be?" Clara asked, though she could guess. Elizabeth glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "Traveling with that man, dressed like it? She seemed unable to finish the sentence. "Like a person who works for a living?" Clara suggested. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed pink. "Like a woman with no regard for propriety or decency. I know what he must have done to you, how he must have corrupted you, and I want to help." Clara felt a familiar surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And how exactly do you propose to help me?" "My father has connections. We could find you a position as a governess or companion, somewhere far from here. You could start over, live as a proper woman should." Elizabeth's eyes were bright with missionary zeal. "It's not too late to redeem yourself." "Redeem myself from what?" "From this." Elizabeth gestured at Clara's practical clothing, her sun-darkened skin, her calloused hands. "From living like a man, from traveling with that creature, from abandoning all sense of feminine virtue." Clara studied this earnest young woman and felt something like pity. "And what would you have me do instead? Marry the first man who'll have me? Spend my days embroidering and fainting at the sight of blood?" "I would have you live as God intended women to live," Elizabeth replied firmly. "Protected and cherished, not whatever this is." "This," Clara said quietly, "is freedom." Before Elizabeth could respond, Hank's massive form appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene with one glance, his pale eyes moving from Clara to the strange woman and back again. "Everything all right here?" he asked mildly. "Miss Hartwell was just leaving," Clara replied, her eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. She was offering to help me become a proper lady. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Hank's expression. That so? And what did you tell her? I told her I wasn't interested in going backwards. Elizabeth gasped at the implied insult, but Clara was already turning away. She had more important things to think about than the narrow-minded opinions of sheltered bank daughters. As they left town an hour later, Hank was unusually talkative. You handled that well, he said as they rode through the morning mist. Did I? I felt like I was cruel to her. Sometimes kindness looks cruel to folks who mistake chains for jewelry, Hank replied. That girl thinks she's free because her cage is pretty, but she's still in a cage. Clara considered this as they rode. Hank, why did you really buy me from my father? Hank was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he said, You ever hear tell of a woman named Mary Fields? No. Called her Stagecoach Mary. Black woman, big as me and twice as tough. Delivered mail through some of the worst country you can imagine, fought off bandits and wolves, never missed a delivery. Hank's voice held deep respect. Most folks thought she was crazy for trying to do a man's job. But Mary knew something they didn't. What was that? That there ain't no such thing as men's work and women's work. There's just work that needs doing, and people strong enough to do it. Hank glanced at her. Your daddy saw you as a burden because he couldn't imagine you being anything else. But I saw something different. What did you see? I saw a hawk with a broken wing, Hank said simply. And I thought maybe, with time and patience, that wing might heal. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. And has it? Healed, I mean? Hank reined in his horse and turned to look at her directly. Girl, you stood up to that hotel clerk yesterday like you owned the place. You told that Hartwell woman exactly what you thought of her offer to save you. And this morning, you're sitting that horse like you were born to it, with enough weapons to outfit a small army and the skills to use every one of them. His weathered face creaked into a rare full smile. I'd say your wing's healing just fine. Winter came early that year, forcing them to hole up in a lined shack in the foothills of the mountains. The cabin was crude but solid, with thick walls that kept out most of the wind and a fireplace that actually drew properly. Clara had expected the isolation to be difficult, but instead she found it peaceful. For weeks, there was nothing to do but read. Hank had a surprising collection of books, practice her skills, and listen to his stories. It was during one of these long winter evenings that Clara finally learned about Hank's past. You ever wonder why a man like me never married? He asked as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside like a living thing. Clara had wondered, actually. For all his rough appearance, Hank was intelligent, kind, and surprisingly gentle. I assumed you preferred being alone. Hank poked at the fire with a stick. I was married once. Long time ago, back in Ohio. Her name was Sarah, and she was the prettiest, sweetest thing you ever saw. I was working as a blacksmith then, thought I had my whole life figured out. Clara waited, sensing there was more to the story. Sarah died giving birth to our daughter. The baby lived for 3 days. Hank's voice was steady, but Clara could hear the old pain beneath it. After that, I didn't see much point in staying where everything reminded me of what I'd lost. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly. Don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for Sarah, who never got to see her daughter grow up. Be sorry for all the women like her, who die because they got no choice but to keep having babies until their bodies give out. Hank looked at her directly. That's why I do what I do, Clara. Why I teach women like you to be strong. I don't understand. Sarah was sweet and delicate and completely dependent on me for everything. When trouble came, she had no skills to save herself, no strength to fall back on. She was like that little bird Elizabeth Hartwell, pretty and helpless in her cage. Hank's pale eyes reflected the firelight. I swore after she died that if I ever had the chance to help another woman learn to fly, I'd take it. Clara felt something deep and profound shift in her understanding. So all of this, everything you've taught me, it's been about making sure I never have to depend on anyone else to survive. About making sure you have choices, Hank corrected gently. Sarah never had choices. Your daddy made sure you didn't have any either. But now you do. Clara stared into the fire, processing this revelation. Everything made sense now: Hank's patience, his insistence on teaching her not just to hunt but to think independently, his pride when she stood up for herself. "What happens when spring comes?" she asked finally. "When you've taught me everything you can? Then you decide what kind of life you want to live," Hank replied. "And you'll have the skills to live it." The rest of that winter passed in intensive learning. Hank taught Clara advanced tracking techniques, how to read weather patterns weeks in advance, and the delicate art of negotiating with both civilized people and hostile tribes. More importantly, he taught her to trust her own judgment. "Don't matter what I think," he would say when Clara asked for his opinion on some decision. "I ain't gonna be with you forever. You gotta learn to listen to your own inner voice." By the time the snow began to melt, Clara realized she had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The frightened girl who had been sold by her father was gone completely, replaced by someone who could track a deer across rocky ground, negotiate for supplies in 3 different languages, and face down hostile strangers without flinching. Spring brought unexpected visitors to their camp. Clara was practicing with her bow when she heard horses approaching, 3 riders, moving fast but not panicked. She notched an arrow and moved to a position where she could cover Hank, who was cleaning fish by the stream. The riders were an odd group: a well-dressed Mexican man in his 40s, a grizzled cowboy who looked like he'd been born in the saddle, and a young Native American woman wearing traditional dress mixed with practical riding gear. "Hank Hunter," the Mexican man called out. "My name is Don Carlos Mendoza. I believe we have mutual friends in Santa Fe." Hank set down his knife and walked over to meet them, his hands conspicuously away from his weapons. "Depends on who you're talking about, Don Carlos." "Miguel Santos. He said you were the best tracker in the territory and that you could be trusted to keep your word." Clara watched the exchange from her concealed position, noting how Hank's posture relaxed slightly at the mention of Santos. "Miguel's good people," Hank acknowledged. "What brings you looking for me?" Don Carlos dismounted, his companions following suit. "We have a proposition. A job that requires someone with your unique skills." "I don't do wet work," Hank said flatly. "Nothing like that. We need someone to guide a wagon train through Apache territory. The Army won't provide escort anymore, and most professional guides won't take the risk. Can't say I blame them. Apache ain't exactly welcoming to trespassers these days. Which is why we need someone who speaks their language and understands their ways." Don Carlos gestured to his companions. "This is Jim Morrison, he'll be handling the actual wagon train. And this is Running Deer. She's half Apache, and she's agreed to help with negotiations if we encounter her mother's people." Clara studied the young woman with interest. Running Deer looked to be about 20, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of quiet competence that reminded Clara of herself. "What's the cargo?" "Things. Settlers mostly. Families heading to California. Some trade goods, but nothing that should interest the Apache." Don Carlos paused. "The pay is $500. Gold." Clara saw Hank's eyebrows rise slightly. $500 was a small fortune. "When do we leave?" 2 weeks. The train's assembling in Tucson." Hank was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he called out, "Clara, come on down here." Clara emerged from her hiding spot, arrow still notched but pointing at the ground. She saw the visitor's eyes widen as they took in her appearance. A young woman armed like a warrior, moving with the confidence of someone comfortable with violence. "This is my apprentice," Hank said simply. "She comes with me or I don't go." Don Carlos looked uncertain. "Senor Hunter, with respect, this is dangerous work. Perhaps the senorita would be safer." "The senorita," Clara interrupted calmly, "can speak for herself. And what she has to say is that she's been training for exactly this kind of work." Running Deer studied Clara with obvious interest. "You know Apache country?" "I know how to track, hunt, and fight. I know how to read the land and the weather. And I know how to follow orders when necessary and think for myself when it's not." Clara met the other woman's gaze steadily. "What I don't know, I can learn." A slow smile spread across Running Deer's face. "I like her," she said to Hank. "She has warrior spirit." Jim Morrison looked skeptical. Begging your pardon, miss, but this ain't no Sunday picnic. We're talking about crossing some of the most dangerous territory in the West, with families depending on us to get them through alive. Then they'll be depending on the right people, Clara replied evenly. Because I don't intend to let anyone die on my watch. Hank's weathered face cracked into one of his rare full smiles. There's your answer, Don Carlos. We both go or neither of us goes. Don Carlos looked from Hank to Clara and back again, clearly trying to assess this unexpected development. Finally, he nodded. Very well. But I hope you understand what you're getting into. Do any of us ever? Clara asked. After the visitors left, Hank began preparing for the journey with characteristic thoroughness. Clara found herself both excited and nervous about the prospect of her first real job. You sure about this? Hank asked as they checked their equipment. This ain't gonna be like our little excursions. People are gonna be counting on us to keep them alive. I'm sure, Clara replied, surprised by her own certainty. This is what you've been training me for, isn't it? To be someone who can handle responsibility. Part of it, Hank agreed. But there's a difference between being able to do something and being ready to live with the consequences if you fail. Clara considered this. What would you have done if I'd said I wasn't ready? Gone alone, I reckon. Or turned down the job. But you didn't even hesitate to include me. Hank looked at her with something that might have been pride. Because I know you're ready, even if you don't know it yet. Tucson was a sprawling, chaotic mixture of Mexican adobe, American wood construction, and Native American influences. The wagon train was assembled just outside of town, and Clara was amazed by the sheer size of it. 30 wagons, nearly 100 people, and enough livestock to populate a small ranch. The emigrants were a diverse group, farmers from Missouri seeking rich California soil, merchants hoping to establish trade routes, and families simply looking for a fresh start. What they all had in common was a combination of hope and fear that Clara found both inspiring and sobering. Don Carlos introduced them to the wagon master, a competent-looking man named Thomas Fletcher who seemed relieved to have professional guides. Thank God, Fletcher said when he met them. Half these people have never been west of Kansas, and the other half think they're going on some kind of adventure. They have no idea what they're facing. Clara spent the first few days getting to know the emigrants and assessing their capabilities. What she found was both encouraging and terrifying. There were skilled craftsmen, experienced farmers, and capable women who could cook for an army and nurse the sick. But there were also city folk who had never slept outdoors, families with more luggage than supplies, and men who thought their inexperience could be overcome with bravado. We're going to lose people, she said to Hank after their initial assessment. Probably, he agreed matter-of-factly. Question is, how many, and can we live with the answer? Running Deer proved to be an invaluable addition to their group. She knew Apache territory intimately and had contacts among various tribes that might mean the difference between safe passage and massacre. My mother's brother is war chief of the Chiricahua, she explained to Clara as they scouted ahead of the main column. If we encounter his band, I can negotiate. But there are other groups, younger warriors who might not listen to traditional protocols. What do we do if we run into hostiles? Claire asked. Depends on the situation. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you run, sometimes you negotiate. The trick is knowing which is which. Running Deer studied Clara with curiosity. Hank says you're learning fast. That you have good instincts. I have a good teacher. Teachers can only show you the path. Walking it is up to you. Running Deer paused. There are not many women like us, Clara. We must look out for each other. Clara felt a warmth at being included in that us. For the first time since leaving her father's farm, she felt like she might be part of something larger than just her own survival. The first week of travel went smoothly. The weather was good, the emigrants were still enthusiastic, and they made reasonable time across relatively easy terrain. Clara began to think that maybe this job wouldn't be as difficult as she'd feared. She should have known better. The trouble started on the 8th day, when young Billy Morrison, Jim's nephew, came racing back to the main column with news that he'd spotted Apache sign ahead. How many? Hank asked tersely. Hard to say, Billy replied, trying to catch his breath. Maybe a dozen. They've been watching us for at least 2 days. Clara felt her stomach tighten. What do? We talk, Running Deer said firmly. If they wanted to attack, they would have done it already. They're curious about us. Fletcher wanted to circle the wagons and prepare for a fight, but Hank overruled him. That's a good way to turn a conversation into a war, he explained. We keep moving, stay alert, but we don't make any aggressive moves. An hour later, they appeared, a dozen Apache warriors on horseback, emerging from the landscape as if they'd been carved from the rock itself. They were painted for war, but their weapons remained sheathed. Running Deer rode forward slowly, her hands visible and empty. Clara watched tensely as she spoke with what appeared to be the group's leader in rapid Apache. The conversation went on for several minutes, with gestures toward the wagon train and occasional glances in Clara's direction. Finally, Running Deer returned. They are scouting for a larger band, she reported. Their war chief wants to meet with our leaders. That's good news, right? Fletcher asked hopefully. Could be, Hank replied. Or it could be a trap. Only one way to find out. The meeting was arranged for the next morning. Clara found herself chosen as part of the delegation, much to Fletcher's dismay. This is no place for a woman, he protested. If things go bad, I'll be exactly where I need to be, Clara interrupted. I'm not going to hide in the wagons while other people handle the dangerous work. That night, as she cleaned her weapons and prepared for what might be her first real test, Clara reflected on how much she had changed. 6 months ago, the thought of sitting down with Apache warriors would have terrified her into paralysis. Now, while she was certainly nervous, she was also excited by the challenge. You ready for this? Hank asked as they prepared to ride out. As ready as I'll ever be, Clara replied. Besides, someone told me once that being scared doesn't matter as long as you do what needs doing anyway. Hank's weathered face cracked into a smile. Smart man, whoever told you that? The Apache camp was a marvel of efficient organization, low profile, easily defensible, and positioned to give the warriors maximum visibility of the surrounding terrain. Clara counted at least 50 warriors, though she suspected there were more hidden in the rocks above. The war chief was a man in his 40s named Iron Wolf, with intelligent eyes and an air of absolute authority. He studied their small delegation with unconcealed assessment, his gaze lingering on Clara with particular interest. Running Deer made the introductions in Apache, then switched to English for the benefit of the others. Iron Wolf welcomes you to his territory. He wishes to know why you bring so many whites through his lands. We're taking families to California, Hank replied simply. They mean no harm to your people or your land. Iron Wolf spoke again, his tone measured but firm. He says all whites bring harm, whether they mean to or not, Running Deer translated. They take water, hunt game, sometimes leave sickness behind. Clara found herself studying the Apache chief, trying to read his intentions. His complaint was reasonable. Large wagon trains did put pressure on limited resources in desert country. Ask him what it would take for safe passage, she said quietly. Running Deer looked surprised but relayed the question. Iron Wolf's response was lengthy and animated. He wants tribute, Running Deer reported. Cattle, trade goods, ammunition. And he wants assurance that your people will stay on the established trail and not hunt his game. Fletcher started to object, but Hank cut him off with a gesture. What kind of tribute? The negotiations went on for hours, with offers and counteroffers made in careful diplomatic language. Clara found herself fascinated by the process. It was like watching a complex dance where every gesture mattered. Finally, they reached an agreement: 20 cattle, a selection of trade goods including blankets and coffee, and 50 rounds of ammunition in exchange for safe passage and guides to the next water source. That's highway robbery, Fletcher protested when they returned to the wagon train. That's survival, Hank replied bluntly. We can afford to lose 20 cattle. We can't afford to lose 20 people. The exchange took place the next morning with elaborate ceremony. Clara watched as Iron Wolf inspected each item carefully, testing the quality of the blankets and examining the ammunition with the eye of an expert. As they prepared to move out, Iron Wolf approached Clara directly and spoke to her in broken English. Different, he said, studying her with those keen eyes. Not like other white women. How am I different? Iron Wolf considered his words carefully. You have warrior spirit. Like Apache woman. Is good. He nodded approvingly. Your people need more like you. Clara felt a flush of pride at the unexpected compliment. Coming from a man whose people had been fighting for their survival for generations, it meant something. As the wagon train continued its journey under Apache escort, Clara reflected on the morning's events. She had been part of a successful negotiation that might have saved dozens of lives, and she had earned the respect of a warrior chief. 6 months ago, she had been a piece of property to be sold. Now she was becoming something she couldn't have imagined. They were 3 days out from the Apache camp when the real crisis hit. It started with Mrs. Henderson's baby developing a fever, then spread rapidly through the younger children in the train. By the second day, 5 children were seriously ill, and the adults were beginning to panic. It's cholera, declared Dr. Williams, a pompous man from Philadelphia who had appointed himself the train's medical authority. We need to quarantine the sick and pray it doesn't spread further. Clara had her doubts about the diagnosis, but she wasn't a doctor. What she did know was that panic could kill a wagon train faster than disease. What do you think? She asked Hank quietly as they watched the frightened emigrants huddle around their wagons. I think Williams is an idiot, Hank replied bluntly. This ain't cholera. Kids got the summer flux, probably from bad water. Serious, but not usually fatal if it's treated right. So what do? We find clean water, keep the kids hydrated, and hope their mothers have the sense not to listen to Williams. Hank paused. And we pray we don't lose any of them, because that's the kind of thing that breaks a train's spirit. Clara found herself taking charge of the medical situation, much to Dr. Williams' outrage. She organized the women into shifts to care for the sick children, established strict protocols for water purification, and worked with running deer to gather medicinal plants. This is highly irregular, Williams huffed. I am a trained physician. You're a trained physician who thinks this is cholera when it's obviously dysentery, Clara replied calmly. These children need fluids and rest, not your bloodletting and purging. The confrontation came to a head on the 3rd day when little Johnny Henderson took a turn for the worse. Williams demanded permission to bleed the boy, insisting it was the only way to draw out the disease. You're not putting a knife to that child, Clara said firmly, positioning herself between the doctor and the sick boy. Young woman, you are interfering with proper medical treatment. William's face was red with indignation. I'm preventing you from killing a sick child out of ignorance, Clara replied. Johnny needs fluids, not bloodletting. The argument drew a crowd, including Johnny's terrified parents. Clara could see the fear and uncertainty in their eyes. They wanted to trust the doctor, but Clara's confidence was compelling. Please, Mrs. Henderson whispered. He's my only boy. What if you're wrong? Clara felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical thing. If she was wrong, if the child died because she'd prevented Williams from treating him, she would have to live with that for the rest of her life. I'm not wrong, she said quietly. But even if I am, bleeding a child who's already weak from dehydration will kill him for certain. In the end, the parents trusted Clara's judgment. Williams stalked off in a fury, muttering about unnatural women and disruption of proper order. Clara spent the next 48 hours nursing Johnny Henderson personally, forcing small sips of clean water into him every few minutes and monitoring his condition constantly. She barely slept, barely ate, and found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. On the morning of the 6th day, Johnny's fever broke. By afternoon, he was asking for food. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for saving my boy. Clara felt something inside her chest expand with a warmth she'd never experienced before. This was what it felt like to matter, to make a difference in the world. All 5 children recovered completely. Dr. Williams never acknowledged that Clara had been right, but he also never again questioned her medical judgment. You did good, girl, Hank said as they finally resumed travel. Real good. I was terrified the whole time, Clara admitted. Being scared don't make you weak, Hank replied. Makes you human. The courage comes from doing what's right despite the fear. Clara thought about that as they rolled across the endless desert. She had faced down Apache warriors, defied social convention, and quite possibly saved the lives of 5 children. The frightened girl her father had sold was truly gone now, replaced by someone Clara was proud to be. They were within a week of California when the final test came. Clara was scouting ahead with Running Deer when they spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. Riders, moving fast and coming straight toward the wagon train. Bandits, Running Deer said grimly. At least 20 of them. Clara felt her heart sink. After everything they'd been through, to lose people now, so close to their destination, would be unbearable. They raced back to warn the train, arriving just as the riders came into view. They were a rough-looking bunch, deserters, outlaws, and desperate men who had banded together to prey on emigrants. "Circle the wagons," Fletcher shouted, but Hank countermanded the order. "No time," he called back. "They're too close and we're on open ground. Keep moving and prepare for a fighting retreat." Clara found herself checking her weapons with automatic efficiency, rifle loaded and ready, pistol charged and primed, knife sharp and accessible. She was surprised to realize she felt more calm than afraid. All those months of training had prepared her for exactly this moment. The bandit leader rode forward under a white flag, but his intentions were obvious. "Morning, folks," he called out with false cheer. "Nice day for a donation to the Widows and Orphans Fund, don't you think? What kind of donation did you have in mind?" Hank replied evenly. "Oh, nothing too unreasonable. All your money, half your supplies, and that pretty little blonde girl from the Mitchell wagon." The bandit's smile was predatory. "For the orphans, you understand." Clara felt cold fury wash over her. She had seen enough helpless women, enough victims. "Not today." "Counteroffer," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "You ride away now, and we don't kill all of you." The bandit leader turned to stare at her in amazement. "Well, I'll be damned. Boys, you hear that? The little girl's got some sass." His men laughed, but Clara noticed several of them were nervously checking their weapons. They might be outlaws, but they weren't stupid. A wagon train willing to fight back could be very dangerous. "I'm not a little girl," Clara replied calmly. "I'm someone you really don't want to test." The bandit leader's smile faded. "That so? Well, maybe we'll just take you instead of the blonde. I like a woman with spirit." That was enough. Clara's rifle came up in one smooth motion, and the bandit leader toppled from his horse with a bullet through his chest. "Anyone else want to negotiate?" she asked as chaos erupted around them. The fight was brief but vicious. The emigrants, inspired by Clara's example, fought like cornered wildcats. When the dust settled, half the bandits were dead and the rest were in full retreat. Clara found herself standing over the body of the man she'd killed, surprised by her lack of remorse. He had threatened innocent people, including children. She had stopped him. It was that simple. "First time?" Running Deer asked quietly, appearing at her shoulder. "Yes. It gets easier. Not the killing, that should never be easy, but living with the necessity of it." Running Deer studied Clara with something like pride. "You did well. Your people are alive because of your courage." That evening, as they made camp, Clara found herself surrounded by grateful emigrants. The women who had once looked at her with suspicion now treated her with something approaching reverence. The men who had doubted her competence now sought her opinion on everything from guard duty to route planning. "You've become quite the leader," Hank observed as they sat by their fire. "I didn't ask to be a leader." Best leaders never do. Leadership ain't about wanting power, it's about accepting responsibility. Hank poked at the fire with a stick. "Question now is, what do you want to do with it?" Clara had been thinking about that very question. When they reached California, the wagon train would disperse and everyone would go their separate ways. What would she do then? "I don't know," she admitted. 6 months ago, my biggest worry was whether Papa would remember to feed me. Now people are looking to me to keep them alive." "Change is like that," Hank said philosophically. "Happens slow, then all at once. One day you're one person, next day you're someone else entirely." Clara thought about the girl who had stood beside her father's wagon, waiting to be sold like livestock. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a half-remembered dream. "Hank," she said finally, "what happens to us? After California, I mean." Hank was quiet for a long time. "I reckon that depends on what you want to happen. I want to keep doing this. Helping people, making a difference. But I don't know how. Could always set yourself up as a guide. Lord knows there's plenty of demand, and you've got the skills for it now." Hank paused. "Or you could do something else entirely. Point is, you got choices now. More choices than most people ever dream of." Clara nodded, staring into the fire and thinking about possibilities. Whatever she decided, she knew one thing for certain: she would never again be anyone's property, anyone's burden, or anyone's victim. The hawk had remembered how to fly. 3 years later, Clara sat in the office of the California Emigrant Guide Service, her office, reviewing the latest requests for escorts and guides. The business had grown beyond her wildest expectations, handling everything from small family groups to major freight operations. Running Deer entered with a cup of coffee and a stack of correspondence. "The Henley party wants to book passage to Oregon Territory," she reported. "Family of 12, including 6 children under 10. What do you think?" Claire asked. Running Deer had become her full partner in the business, contributing her knowledge of tribal territories and diplomatic skills to complement Clara's tracking and leadership abilities. "Could be tricky. The Modoc have been stirred up lately, and it's a long haul through rough country." Running Deer paused. "But the money's good, and they seem like decent people." Clara nodded. "Set up a meeting. We'll assess them properly before we commit." As Running Deer left to arrange the appointment, Clara reflected on how much her life had changed. She owned her own business, employed a dozen guides and scouts, and was consulted by territorial officials on matters of frontier policy. The frightened girl who had been sold for $20 had become a woman of influence and independence. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. To her surprise, it was Hank. She hadn't seen him in 6 months, and he looked older, more weathered than she remembered. "Afternoon, boss lady," he said with his characteristic dry humor. Clara jumped up to embrace him, surprised by how genuinely happy she was to see her old mentor. "Hank, what brings you to town?" "Retirement," he said simply. "Getting too old for this game. Figured it was time to see what you'd made of yourself." Clara gestured around the office with obvious pride. "What do you think?" Hank studied the maps on the walls, the professional correspondence on her desk, the certificates of appreciation from grateful emigrants. "I think," he said slowly, "that $20 was the best investment I ever made." They spent the afternoon catching up, with Clara telling him about her recent expeditions and Hank sharing news from his travels. As evening approached, Clara found herself asking the question that had been on her mind for 3 years. "Hank, why me? Of all the people you could have helped, why did you choose me?" Hank considered the question seriously. "You remember what I told you about Sarah? About how she died because she had no choices?" "Yes." "Well, I saw you standing there beside your daddy's wagon and I thought, here's another Sarah. Another woman the world's trying to keep in a cage. But then you looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something different." Hank's pale eyes met hers. "I saw fire. Hidden, maybe, beaten down by circumstances, but still burning. And I thought, maybe this one can learn to fly." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "And did I? Learn to fly, I mean?" Hank gestured toward the window, where they could see the bustling street of Sacramento, filled with emigrants and fortune-seekers heading west toward their dreams. "Girl, you're not just flying. You're teaching others how to do it too." That evening, Clara walked through the streets of the city she now called home, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about her father, who had sold her out of weakness and desperation. She wondered if he was still alive, if he ever regretted his choice. Surprisingly, she found she felt more pity for him than anger. She thought about Elizabeth Hartwell, the banker's daughter who had tried to save her from an unconventional life. Clara hoped Elizabeth had eventually found happiness in her gilded cage, but she was grateful she had chosen a different path. Most of all, she thought about all the women still out there, women trapped by circumstance, by society's expectations, by their own fears. Women who, like her, had forgotten they had wings. Clara smiled as she made her decision. Tomorrow she would start working on her book, A Woman's Guide to Western Survival. Not just the practical skills of tracking and shooting and living off the land, but the more important lessons about finding your own strength, making your own choices, and refusing to let anyone else define what you could become. The hawk that had once been caged was not just free now. She was helping other birds remember how to fly. And in the growing darkness of the California evening, Clara Thompson, no longer anyone's property, no longer anyone's burden, but entirely and completely her own person, walked home to plan her next adventure.